See, this is what was going on. This was the terror. You talk about terrorism. Black people lived under the specter of racial terror every day of our lives.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And this was the South that a 26-year-old minister from Boston University named Martin King came home to in 1955. Talk about the Montgomery bus boycott. Just days after they announced the formation of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and just days after, look, when King started out, he didn't have no big bill of civil rights. If you read Stride Toward Freedom, they had some very simple demands. Black people sit anywhere we can on the bus and hire some black bus drivers. That was it. It wasn't like we didn't want to tear down Jim Crow and all that stuff. Very simple. But just to make those demands on the system, you took your life in your hands. Within days after announcing the Montgomery bus boycott, they blew up King's house with his wife and children in the house. What would you do?
After all, we know in a nonviolent movement that there are these possibilities, and we go on with the faith that unmerited suffering is redemptive.
Dr. King, I think the demonstration was largely to get your voting rights bill through. Was it necessary for that purpose? Aren't you going to get that bill? And wouldn't you have gotten it whether or not you marched?
Well, the demonstration was certainly for the voting rights bill. However, we must recognize that there are other very tragic conditions existing in the state of Alabama which are as humiliating, as degrading, and as unjust as the denial of the right to vote, namely police brutality. And we marched on the state of the capital of Alabama to protest the long night of brutality, the constant murders that continue to take place in that state, for after all, under the administration of Governor Wallace, there have been 10 persons actually killed and murdered, and nothing has been done about it. There have been untold bombings of homes and churches. Again, nothing has been done about this on the whole, and we were marching there to protest these brutalities, these murders, and all of the things that go along with them, as much as to gain the right to vote. So it was a twofold march aimed at trying to rectify the conditions of Alabama and expose the evils that are deeply engulfed in that state.
What would you do if somebody blew your house up? Would you continue on that path? What would you do if somebody said, well, yeah, Mr. Hamm, you got a lot to say, but we know where your wife works. We know where your children go to school. And if you keep this thing, this agitation thing up, you're going to find out something. What would you do? But King, early on, was a man of conscience. And he kept true to what he believed, his religious principles and his conscience. He was convicted. There was no other path for him. This is what happens when you are convicted. Fear doesn't go away when you're convicted. You still have fear. You're not dead, you got feelings. But when you're convicted, you can't live with yourself if you don't follow your conscience. Right. 27 years old, they blew up his house. And he stayed on the path. He wrote the book Stride Toward Freedom, had a book signing up in Harlem just a few years later. Black woman come up to him and said, "Are you Martin Luther King?" He said, "Yeah." She said, and took a fingernail file and stabbed it in his chest. And if you read his last speech that he gave on April 3rd, what did he say? He said the doctors told him if I had sneezed, the fire would have burst my aorta and I would have drowned in my own blood. Imagine that. One of the people, one of your own kind that you trying to help, trying to lift up out of the muck and mire of oppression, stab you and almost kill you. What would you do? I hear folks going around here now talking about, I ain't doing this. These people don't care. I ain't making no sacrifice for them. They ain't gonna do nothing. But King was convicted. He was a man of conscience, and he had to follow his conscience.
Here is your moderator, Ned Brooks.
Resuming our interview, our guest today on Meet the Press is Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who is in San Francisco. On our panel of reporters in Washington, D.C., you have just met Lawrence Spivak. Our other reporters today are Tom Wickert of the New York Times, James J. Kilpatrick of the Richmond News Leader, and John Chancellor of NBC News. We'll continue the questions now with Mr. Wickert.
Dr. King, you said a moment ago that Alabama was a state that gives respectability to the resistance and defiance of the law. And you listed an observance of the law by local agencies in the South as one of the cardinal aims that you were seeking. Yet on March the 9th, you led the second march on Montgomery in violation of a federal injunction not to march. You said that order was unjust, and John Lewis, one of your colleagues, said that the Negroes had a constitutional right to march, injunction or no injunction. Now, was that in keeping with the spirit of nonviolence and the restraint that has always characterized your movement, and could you explain your reasoning in defying the court order that day?
Well, let me say two things to that, Mr. Wicker. First, I did not consider myself defying a court order that particular day. I consulted with my attorneys before the march, and they stated that they felt that it was an invalid order and that it would not be, that I would not be in contempt of court violating the court order if I led the march to the point of having a moral confrontation with the state troopers at the point where the people were brutalized on Sunday. So I still don't consider that breaking a court order or breaking what I consider an unjust law. On the other hand, I must be honest enough to say that I do feel that there are two types of laws. One is a just law and one is an unjust law. I think we all have moral obligations to obey just laws. On the other hand, I think we have moral obligations to disobey unjust laws because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. I think the distinction here is that when one breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, he must do it openly, he must do it cheerfully, he must do it lovingly, he must do it civilly, not uncivilly, and he must do it with a willingness to accept the penalty. And any man who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail in order to arouse the conscience of the community on the injustice of the law is at that moment expressing the very highest respect for law.
Well, I can sympathize with a good deal of that, but it seems to me you get into a very difficult point here at which one man's conscience is set, in fact, above the conscience of society, which has invoked the law. How are we to enforce law when a doctrine is preached that one man's conscience may tell him that the law is unjust when other men's conscience don't tell them that?
And I think you enforce it, and I think you deal with it by not allowing anarchy to develop. I do not believe in defying the law, as many of the segregationists do. I do not believe in evading the law, as many of the segregationists do. The fact is that most of the segregationists and racists that I see are not willing to suffer enough for their beliefs in segregation, and they are not willing to go to jail. I think the chief norm for guiding the situation is the willingness to accept the penalty. And I don't think any society can call an individual irresponsible who breaks a law and willingly accepts accepts the penalty if conscience tells him that that law is unjust. And I think that this is a long tradition in our society. It's a long tradition in biblical history. Meshach and Abednego broke an unjust law, and they did it because they had to be true to a higher moral law. The early Christians practiced civil disobedience in a superb manner. Academic freedom would not be a reality today if it had not been for Socrates, and if it had not been for Socrates' willingness to practice civil disobedience. And I would say that in our own history, there's nothing that expresses a massive civil disobedience any more than the Boston Tea Party, and yet we give this to our young people and our students as a part of the great tradition of our nation. So I think we're in good company when we break unjust laws, and I think those who are willing to do it and accept the penalty are those who are part of the saving of the nation.
They throw it off, right? One day my Aunt Joan brought home a record album, a speech by Dr. King. The first speech I heard from him was not the I Have a Dream speech. When I was still about, I guess, in the 7th or 8th grade, I got this record from my Aunt Joan called In the Struggle for Freedom and Human Dignity. It was a speech that Martin Luther King gave at the Armory in New York when he had just returned from Oslo, Norway, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Now I remember Dr. King even then saying things that I didn't quite understand. He was critical of our quote-unquote system of monopolistic capitalism. These were his words. He said America had a surplus of food, but children went to bed hungry at night. He said, I know where that surplus food can be stored, in the stomachs of the children that go to bed hungry at night. I never forget that. That was 1966. You know, I can remember, how many people can remember where they were when President Kennedy was killed? Remember where you were and what you was doing? I can remember it like any. But you know, when Dr. King was killed, like it was like business as usual. I mean, but here's the irony, right? 40 years later, we all celebrating the birthday of Martin Luther King because his legacy is enduring.
Now let me go on to say that if we are to deal with all of the problems that I've talked about, if we are to bring America to the point that we have one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, there are certain things that we must do. The job ahead must be massive and positive. We must develop massive action programs all over the United States of America in order to deal with the problems that I have mentioned. Now, in order to develop these massive action programs, we've got to get rid of one or two false notions that continue to exist in our society. One is the notion that only time can solve the problem of racial injustice. I'm sure you've heard this idea. It is the notion almost that is something in the very flow of time that will miraculously cure all evils. And I've heard this over and over again. There are those, and they're often sincere people, who say to Negroes and their allies in the white community that we should slow up and just be nice and patient and continue to pray, and in 100 or 200 years the problem will work itself out, because only time can solve the problem. I think that is an answer to that myth, and it is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme righteous in our nation, have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right. Now there's another notion that gets out. It's around everywhere. It's in the South, it's in the North, it's in California and all over our nation. It's a notion that legislation can't solve the problem. It can't do anything in this area. And those who project this argument contend that you've got to change the heart and that you can't change the heart through legislation. Now, I would be the first one to say that there is real need for a lot of heart changing in our country, and I believe in changing the heart. I preach about it. I believe in the need for conversion in many instances and regeneration, to use theological terms. And I would be the first to say that if the race problem in America is to be solved, the white person must treat the Negro right, not merely because the law says it, but because it's natural, because it's right, and because the Negro is his brother. And so I realize that if we are to have a truly integrated society, men and women will have to rise to the majestic heights of being obedient to the unenforceable. But after saying this, let me say another thing which gives the other side, and that is that although it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. Even though it may be true that the law cannot change the heart, it can restrain the heartless. Even though it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it can and it does change the habits of men. And when you begin to change the habits of men, pretty soon the attitudes will be changed, pretty soon the hearts will be changed. Now I'm convinced that we still